Welcome to the first in our series of interviewing experts in the divorce world. We're starting with pensions, which are often the single largest asset outside the family home in a divorce, and they often cause quite a lot of confusion and questions. So we're joined by pensions expert Rhys Taylor. Rhys is a barrister at 36 family chambers in London. Amongst his many other accolades, he's a specialist in pensions on divorce. He's a member of the Pensions Advisory Group, the Family Procedure Rule Committee, and he's a co-author of the third edition of Pensions on Divorce, which is a practitioner's handbook. He's also a contributor to the Family Court Practice and a recorder. So Rhys, how are pensions dealt with on a divorce?
Good question. There are two main ways in which pensions can be dealt with, and then I'll mention some others in a moment. So there's something called pension sharing, which came in for divorces after December 2000, and that involves someone's pension having some of the value in it taken out and put into another pension, simply. That's one way. Another way is for there to be something called offsetting, and it's trading apples and pears. So it's saying, well, you keep the house and I'll keep the pension, taking the values into account. Two other ways which one doesn't really commend. There's something called pension attachment orders. They were originally called earmarking orders and came in 1996. In 2000, they were called attachment orders. No one really does those anymore. The Ministry of Justice statistics suggest that they are being made, but with the greatest respect to the statistics, I think they have to be wrong. I see a lot of pension cases. I never see an attachment order. The disadvantage of them is, unlike the pension sharing order, where you take some capital out of pension A and put it into pension B, an attachment order just parasitically sits on top of pension A. And so if somebody dies, the pension dies with them. And then the last way in which I would not commend pensions being dealt with on divorce is simply ignoring them, which sadly is what some people do.
So as Sarah mentioned at the start, you're part of the Pensions Advisory Group. Do you mind just giving us a bit of an overview about what you've been working on recently and some information about the group?
Yeah, okay. So the Pension Advisory Group was set up by a group of practitioners. It started really with an idea from Hilary Woodward, who's an academic, and myself. And we'd done a paper back in 2016 now, where we'd worked with pension experts, and we realised in the process of putting that paper together just how much we had to learn from one another. In one sense, we spoke a common language, but in another sense, we were completely misunderstanding what each different bit of the professional process were up to. And so at one point during the preparation of this paper, we all sat in a room together, and it was obvious that the synergy of getting everyone together was very, very powerful. And so afterwards, Hilary said, well, why don't we try and do this in a more formal basis, bring the single joint experts who normally provide reports to court together with barristers, solicitors, academics, financial advisors, and importantly, judges, so that we can have a conversation outside of the confines of a courtroom. Because the difficulties in a courtroom necessarily in England and Wales, it's an adversarial process. Pensions are complicated, and with the greatest respect to everyone involved, sometimes there's just so much going on with pensions that it's more than one person can really sort of carry around in their head. So the idea of the Pension Advisory Group originally was to get the best thinking across the piece all into a report, so that there would be a standard guide that would be available to assist parties, lawyers and judges. That was originally published in 2019. It was a very well received report and is used significantly in the process of negotiation and litigating pensions on divorce. And about 18 months ago, we decided rather foolishly, I fear, given how much work it turned out to be, that it was time to update the report and to reflect on some of the changes that had happened in the last few years and to bring it up to speed. So there was a brand new report that was published at the end of December. And if anyone wants to access that, they can find it on the Nuffield Foundation website. Working alongside the Pension Advisory Group, there's an absolutely wonderful charity called Law for Life Advice Now. And what they do is they provide guides for people who can't afford a lawyer. And what they did is they took the original Pension Advisory Group report and they converted it into a non-lawyer's version of the report. And that really is a superb piece of work. And if you're ever trying to understand pensions, or perhaps you're against litigants in person who won't accept what you're saying, you could send that to them as a really, really helpful and authoritative and easy to access guide.
And what would the key takeaway be from that report?
Which one? The lawyer version or the non-lawyer version?
Just the non-lawyer version, please.
Okay, so the non-lawyer version really tracks the ground that the lawyer version tracks, but it does it in a far more accessible way. But I think the key message, and I'm going to come back to this several times in the discussion we have now, it is about not putting pensions in the too complicated box, not putting them in the too complicated box in terms of understanding their value, and also, really importantly, not putting them in the too difficult emotional box, because there's quite a bit of research, which we'll talk about in a moment, which rather suggests that people sometimes feel that pensions are off limits in divorce, and they're not. They are matrimonial assets.
So in the cases where it'd be useful to bring an expert in, which cases do you think would be the right ones?
Well, in an ideal world, having a single joint expert, maybe an actuary or a financial advisor who's very, very well versed in the world of pensions, it can be helpful in all kinds of cases. But the test in family proceedings is a report necessary. And there are some difficulties with the way in which the obtaining of expert evidence for pensions on divorce holds up proceedings, because they can take a long time to arrive, and also they to get a good one, they can be quite expensive. And so there's a real tension between trying to do a Rolls-Royce service and make sure that no stone is unturned, but also to keep the wheels of justice turning and not slowing things down if really the pension report is not going to make a really material difference to the outcome of the case. And so we'll talk about the two ends of the spectrum. The first is the multi-million-pound case. So there's a very famous case last year called CMX. The assets were worth about 25 million, and the judge said we didn't really need a pension report here. There's enough assets going around. We don't really need to understand the finer points of the pension, which is a very, very small part of the overall picture. At the other end of the scale, which is where most people have to wrangle, is, well, at what level do you say you need a report? There are different types of pension. Defined contribution pensions are a bit like a savings account, and they're quite easy to value because the value of them is the cash equivalent that you'll get on an annual basis. Defined benefit pensions are the more difficult pensions to value, because the benefits which they provide can be more valuable than the cash equivalent which is disclosed on the annual statement. And what the Pension Advisory Group have suggested, and they're only tram lines, they're not hard and fast rules. There's always exceptions, I'm afraid, in family law. But what they've suggested is that if the pensions are worth less than £100,000, you might well not need an expert. If the pensions are worth between £100,000 and £200,000, you might well want to consider a pension expert. And if they're worth over £200,000, you would probably want to have a pension expert. But as I say, they're only tramlines, and there can be circumstances, for instance, where the pension is actually quite straightforward. You can have an NHS pension which is worth £500,000, but it's the only pension in the case. The party's the same age. And one of the quirks of public sector pensions, like the NHS pension, is that rather than taking the capital out of the scheme entirely, the NHS will provide a new pension in the same scheme. So, for instance, if you made a 50-50 order against an NHS pension, then each party would get exactly the same. And so it's actually quite straightforward, and you didn't need a pension expert at all. So as I say, the parameters that I've given a moment ago are only parameters. There are always exceptions.
Oh, that's a really useful guide. Thank you. And as you were saying, there's instances where you might not need an expert. When would a pension not be deemed a matrimonial asset? And in what circumstances, if any, would a pension be ring-fenced on a divorce?
Okay, so ring fencing and apportionment is a hugely contentious area, which is argued about intensely in proceedings, and also in conferences and seminars where I've taken questions. I know people have very strong views about it. And the arguments about apportionment or ring fencing are as follows. Say you've got somebody who's been contributing to a pension for 30 years, and 5 years ago he got married, and he and his wife are now in their mid to late 50s, and she doesn't have any pensions of her own. What do? Do you divide the pension equally so that they each are provided for in their retirement, or do you apportion out the premarital accrual of 25 years on the basis that that's really nothing to do with the wife, and she doesn't really have a claim on it? Could work the other way. It could be the husband who's seeking a claim, but it's usually the wife. The first pension advisory group came in for some criticism for suggesting, I think it's unfair criticism, but this was the criticism, that we were suggesting in all circumstances pensions should be divided equally, irrespective of the length of the marriage. And that clearly isn't right. The pension advisory group is only a guide. The law is Section 25 of the Matrimonial Causes Act, which does take into account the length of the marriage. And clearly, in the example that I've given, the length of the marriage is such that there would be some ring fencing of the premarital accrual. But there are other circumstances where it's not so clear cut. And so you might have a situation where the husband has been contributing to his pension for 19 years, and they've been married for 14 years, and they're both in their late 50s, and they're both going to need an income in retirement. And so the court might say, well, if we're looking at a case which is resolving people's needs, and most cases are about resolving people's needs, then it would be overly pernickety to ring fence out that short period of pre-accrual from many years ago. And so it really depends on the circumstances of the case. In those cases where there's pots of money and no one is going to need the money, it's all about whether or not the money is divided according to what we lawyers call a sharing principle, then you would ring fence out the earlier accrual. So you might have a situation, for instance, where the husband has made 10 or 15 years premarital accrual, but there's pots of money elsewhere in the case. The wife isn't going to need that pension to meet her retirement needs, because her needs will be met elsewhere from the capital that's already being shared. And in that case, there will be a ring fencing out of the husband's premarital accrual. Sorry, that's a bit of a complicated reply, but I'm afraid it does get argued about quite a lot.
So the lifetime allowance is another complicated subject and taken into consideration. For those who don't know, what is the lifetime allowance?
Right. So the lifetime allowance was a tax that was introduced back in 2006 for people who the government of the day viewed had more than enough money in their pensions. And so if you breached the lifetime allowance, you were going to have an additional tax when you drew your pension down. And if you drew your pension down as a lump sum, you were going to be taxed at about 55%, and if you drew it down as an income, there would be an additional 25% tax. Over the years, the lifetime allowance has gone up and then come down. So I'm just looking at a table in front of me here, and in 2006 it started at 1.5 million. 2010 went up to 1.8 million, and then it started tracking down until 2021, when the lifetime allowance was 1.73 million. And I'll come back to that figure in a moment. Running alongside the lifetime allowance, which is awkward enough as it is, there were transitional arrangements for people who already had big pensions. And so it was considered that it would be unfair on somebody in 2006 who already had a £1.5 million pension to clobber them with this additional tax. And so there were protections provided that people could apply for as these new rates came in. So down the years, there have been things called primary protection, enhanced protection, fixed protection 2012, fixed protection 2014, and so it goes on. It really is quite a fiddly little area to be looking at. But essentially, although the amount of money you could have in a pension without suffering the lifetime allowance has reduced over the years, people who were well advised and had financial advisors and already had big pensions when these new limits came in were protecting themselves to some extent from those taxes. Coming back to the £1,073,000 limit, it sounds like a lot of money, doesn't it? But in fact, it's rather depressing when you look at how much income that will provide in a retirement. And it caused a particular problem with doctors. And doctors were finding, although they have defined benefit pensions, and the way in which their lifetime allowance was calculated was slightly different. But essentially, the low limit was causing big problems with doctors, and so they were retiring early, refusing to work overtime, those kinds of things, and creating havoc. And so in 2023, the lifetime allowance tax was suspended with a view to it being abolished in April 2024. So presently, on taking of benefits, so for the last year or so, when pension benefits have been taken, they have been assessed against the lifetime allowance, but then a zero tax is payable at the end. From April 2024, the lifetime allowance, the headline is abolished completely, but it gets even curiouser and curiouser. Some people may remember in the 1980s, there was a series of films called Nightmare on Elm Street. And just when you thought that Freddy Krueger had been dealt with. He was jumping out of another manhole cover, and there was goodness knows how many times Freddy Krueger managed to come back and cause havoc. Well, the lifetime allowance is a bit like our friend Freddy Krueger, because what the government has done is it has introduced a new tax called the lump sum allowance, and that limits the amount of tax-free cash that you're able to draw out of your pension. Ordinarily, the sum is 25%, but now there's this additional barrier of the 1,073,000 that was the last lifetime allowance figure. And so if you have a very big pension and you were drawing down a substantial lump sum, then you may be clobbered with the lump sum allowance. So actually, lifetime allowance issues are still relevant. And the further Freddy Krueger point is that the Labour government, or rather the Labour Party, probably their Labour government at some point later this year, are saying that they may well bring it back in, because of course we all know that in numerous respects the country is broke, and tax breaks for people with £1 million pensions isn't necessarily a vote winner as far as the Labour Party are concerned. So there's a possibility that it will be reintroduced at some point in the near future. So these considerations haven't gone away completely.
So just going back to some other helpful reports that have recently come out about pensions and just more broadly about the divisions of assets on divorce, the Fair Shares report. Do you mind just going into a little bit more about that report and specifically about the statistics that they found in relation to pensions in that report, and ideally what your view was on those statistics?
Yeah, well, let me tell you about the Fair Shares report, because it's a really interesting read if you're interested in what happens to people who get divorced. And I'm assuming if you're watching this webinar that you have at least some interest in that topic. The Fair Shares report was a hugely significant piece of research undertaken by Emma Hitchings at Bristol University. I had the privilege, in fact, to be on their advisory committee. I didn't have to do a huge amount of work, but I watched how it developed over a few years. And the project involved a huge survey of people who had got divorced and how they sorted out their finances without having lawyers involved. And so the survey looked at about 20,000 people, and then it drilled down harder with about 2,000 people. And it's got some fascinating headline points as to how people treat their finances on divorce. And just putting pensions to one side for 1 second, one sees emerging from the report a general pragmatism as to what needs to be done. The report is slightly depressing in terms of how broke everybody appears to be, and a lot of the divorcing population have a very small amount of money to divide between them, and hard choices need to be made about keeping the roof over the party's children, and that quite often dominates the outcome. When it comes to pensions, despite all the efforts of the pension advisory group to encourage people to think more carefully about pensions, rather depressingly, it indicates that about 11% of divorces involve people chasing down pension sharing orders. That's not to say that pensions haven't been taken into account, because some people may be trading the house for the pension, but actual pension sharing orders are a relatively small part of the overall picture. And one sees also more orders being made against men than women. I think that might be down to the fact that even in 2024, there's a gender issue in play, and and the reality is that pension wealth is on balance often more held by the men than the women. But there's a whole chapter devoted to pensions on divorce, and the important thing that I would want somebody who's listening to this to take away is that too many people think that the pension is off limits, and they think that the pension belongs to the person who earned it, and that they are somehow breaching some moral code or decency in asking that to be brought into consideration on divorce. As I already said earlier, some people, they just find it too complicated to understand the true value of the pension. But even those people who can sometimes will say, oh, well, don't worry, I won't go after your pension. That really wouldn't be a decent thing to do. And that's a wrong attitude to have. That the pension capital is not the unassailable property of the person who earned it. Subject to arguments about apportionment, these are marital assets which are available for division in exactly the same way as family homes and bank accounts are.
And one of the statistics I'd like to drill down into was that there was only 11% of the cases that they reviewed had a pension sharing order. And of those, only a fifth of them were split equally. In your experience, why do you think that is?
I think pension sharing can be complicated. The process of getting the order, and then once you've got the order, most people would need financial advice to understand how to then implement the order, and so it's complicated. And then so far as whether or not the pension is divided equally or not, there are a whole host of reasons why a pension might not be divided equally. So one may be the apportionment argument that we've already discussed, but another one is, and stay with me on this, the pensions are quite often, not exclusively, but quite often divided by reference to the income that they will produce in retirement. And so you might have a man who's going to have £10,000 a year at 60, and he's got a defined benefit pension. And so if he suffers a 50% pension sharing order, he will have £5,000 a year. His wife will then, or his ex-wife, will take her pension share, and she will go off to buy some benefits with a defined contribution pension in the ordinary course. But it's very often the case that the pension share that she takes with her will not buy her £5,000 a year worth of income. And in those cases where we're looking at parties' needs, quite often, not always, but quite often, the courts say, well, that isn't really fair, is it? These parties have been married 25 years and they've both got equal needs in retirement for meeting their daily outgoings. What we really want to do is we want to aim to get them to have equal pensions. And in the process of doing so, it may be that the wife would need 52, 53, 55% of the pension in order to equalise the incomes in retirement. Now, some judges don't like that. Some judges think, well, you should just take the asset and divide it 50-50 and let people get on with their lives. But in those cases where the finances are tight, those kinds of arguments matter to many people.
So the Galbraith tables, they've been a relatively new introduction, but what are they and how can they help divorcing couples?
Okay, so just go back to the original PAG report. One of the things that we were discussing is whether or not it would be possible to have a set of tables that would enable people to easily value their pension without having to go off to an expert. But it was going to be a very significant piece of work, and quite frankly, by 2019, the original PAG committee had had enough. And so we just did an appendix. saying, well, it would be very interesting if somebody came along and prepared these tables. Jonathan Galbraith is a leading actuary in this field and did just that. And so he's called them the Galbraith tables. And what the Galbraith tables are for, excuse me, what the Galbraith tables are for are valuing the headline gross value of a defined benefit pension. So you might have an occupational pension, a defined benefit pension, that the cash equivalent says it's 400,000, but it would cost 470,000 in order to buy those benefits. And some people would say that understanding that a hidden £70,000 worth of value is important in those cases, particularly where, say, the house is worth £400,000. One can readily see that it sort of holds the the balance of fairness. And so in order to understand the gross value of defined benefit pension, you could go off to an expert, but that could take months. It could cost you a couple of £1,000s to do that. And so what the Galbraith tables do is they provide a multiplier by which you can take the benefits which are being received. So go back to that gentleman who I said was going to have £10,000 at age 60. You can take the husband's current age, the date at which he's going to receive it. That gives you a multiplier, and then you multiply that by the £10,000 a year, which we call the multiplicand, and that will give a gross value of the pension. Now then, the PAG2, which has a group of experts, including Jonathan Galbraith, has debated these tables and cautiously welcomes them. But Jonathan Galbraith doesn't say this is a correct figure for all time. What he says is it's a starting figure. It's a figure that will help you orientate yourself as to what your pension might be worth. There was a case decided recently where there was a pension valuation, and we used the Galbraith tables in comparison, and the difference was about 10%. Now, there's no saying that the expert valuation was the definitively correct valuation either. Some people would say that a 10% difference in value is too big, and that one should really go off to an expert. Other people would say that in financial remedy proceedings, assets are approached with a broad brush, and that you can't definitively value a house. It depends on the day you sell it, who's buying at the time, those kinds of things. And so it may be that a few percentage differences on an asset is something that we simply have to live with. And so using the Galbraith tables, without having instructed an expert, you would be able to get a gross value of a defined benefit pension when you were thinking about trading for the house. And so, for instance, if there was a defined benefit pension, which of course you would get at £10,000 a year for the rest of your life, and you're trying to compare that with, for instance, a family home, you would be able to have some idea of the headline figure. But what the PAG report, both PAG reports say, is that once you've got the headline figure, you then make some adjustments. When you draw down a pension, you pay tax on it, and so that's not value in your back pocket. And also, there's a further judgment, and it is a judgment, and sometimes people say it's a little better than a finger in the air, but there is that sense of, well, what would you prefer? £10,000 a year from 60 for the rest of your life, or would you like a big pile of cash on your kitchen table now? And what would you surrender in terms of your cash, your entitlement to future income, in order to convert it into cash now, to have liquid cash now that you could put on a horse or go on a cruise or something like that? And so quite often lawyers will also make an adjustment for utility, and it all depends on the facts of the case. In cases where the money is tight, sometimes people say, well, there's not a huge justification for utility. The wife and mother in a divorce might have kept the family home because she needs to keep a roof over the children's heads. She can't put that money down on a horse or go on a cruise. That's also illiquid money because it's needed in order to provide for the children. So the utility discount, as it's sometimes called, or the utility adjustment, all depends on what else is going on in the case. And sometimes an adjustment is justified, sometimes it isn't. So Galbraith tables, going back, the gross headline value of a pension, it's not a definitive figure, but it's a tool, not a rule, if I can borrow from another area of family law, and then one would make adjustments from that figure.
So, touching on something that you said there, traditionally the wife would normally go for the family home, as it tends to be the more important asset for them, as it can sometimes be the more emotional asset if that's the place that they've raised their children throughout the marriage. This can lead them to experience what's widely being called pension poverty. What's your experience with clients who have experienced pension poverty, or think are likely to experience pension poverty? And how do you think you can encourage people to give pensions the importance they deserve?
So this is a good question. I am a lawyer and I act on people's instructions, providing they're lawful. So if people say at the fork in the road, I want to go left, my job is to act on my instructions and I go to the left. If I wasn't a lawyer and I was some people's fairy godmother, I would encourage them to do something differently. Because sometimes, and I mean no disrespect in saying this, I'm sat with a lady in her late middle age who's in a big house full of memories that have gone sour, a leaky roof, high maintenance, but she can't bring herself to sell the house. And she says to me, well, look, I'm going to surrender my claims over the pension so that I can keep this house. And she might be doing that in circumstances where she hasn't fully grasped the value of the pension. And what I think sometimes is that that lady's fairy godmother would say, look, downsize, adjust to something that you can afford to live in without worrying about how you're going to pay for it, and also chase some pension, have some apples and have some pears. And so I think sometimes the process of divorce is so traumatic that hanging on to the house is seen as the be all and end all, but it isn't sometimes. And sometimes it's the moment to grasp the nettle and to consider a smaller property and then taking your fair share of pensions as well.
So I think we were talking about at the start the perceived complexity of pensions and how people might be worried about misunderstanding them. How do you think we can dispel this complexity, and how do you think we can make it easier for people to understand pensions and feel like it's not such a scary subject? I don't know if that's too big of a question.
Well, I mean, I've been banging the drum about this for years now, and I think I would come back to the Law for Life and Advice Now guide, which anyone who is refusing to take into account the pensions as an issue in a divorce would be well advised to go away and read that, or to read Chapter 7 of the Fair Shares Report. And what you don't want to do in these circumstances is live too long. You know, if you live too long, then the state pension is going to be a fairly miserable way to eke out your existence. And so, and even with capital in the house, you can, and you downsize later on in retirement. It may well be that you run out of money. Whereas if you have a pension, then and you're properly advised, you can ensure that you have an income so that you're not worrying about baked beans when you're 95. And help us.
So now we've got a fictional case study, and it'd be helpful to have your view on what might happen in a case like this. So there's a family home that's worth £1.2 million. The parties have got investment assets that are about 500,000 in total. The husband has 300,000 of that, and the wife has 200,000 pounds of that. They've split that quite fairly. The husband's worked as a fund manager and has a workplace pension that amounts to about £3 million. And the wife's pension's a lot less. She's got £150,000 in her pot. She was the homemaker, but she's continued to work part-time, reduced her hours as a teacher, and through her work, she's gathered up the pension that she's got. Now they're getting divorced, and there's a large disparity between the pensions. What would be your suggested approach to the pension share, and what sort of issues do you see in those circumstances?
So we'll track back over some of the things we've been discussing over the last half an hour. So first of all, although this looks like a case with a lot of money in it, by the time you've taken the £1.2 million house and the £500,000 investment assets, depending on where you live in the country, but if you live in the southeast, it is most likely that money will all be eaten up in buying housing for the parties, so that they each have a house that is not wholly out of keeping with their former standard of living. And so then we're left with this big pension disparity. Now, I said earlier, well, it's rather depressing to see how much money you'll get a year from £1 million. I think by the time you're up to £3 million, you are in a situation where there's more than enough to go around. It's going to be able to provide for needs in retirement, and half of that will probably provide for needs in retirement. And so the answer to this question, to some significant extent, hinges on how long the parties were married. If that £3 million has been accumulated over a long marriage, then I think the wife has got a good claim to broad equality of pension assets. If the parties have been married for a much shorter period of time, it may well be that there would be some apportionment. We also have to take into account Freddy Krueger here, don't we? Our friend, the lifetime allowance and the lump sum allowance, because we see that the husband is a fund manager, and I'm going to assume he's well paid and he's well advised. And so down the years, he's probably been ensuring that he's got his protections in place. And so you need to bear in mind that even if you have a headline figure of broad equality, because he will have, in all probability, have a protection, in net terms, he will be taxed less on the withdrawal of pension than the wife will have, who won't be able to carry his protections across into her pension share. And so in these circumstances, you probably would want an expert to make sure that you properly understood the lump sum allowance.
So let's say in a more smaller money case, I know we've touched on this before, but in relation to the case study, if in that case there were only two assets and it was the matrimonial home and the pension, and let's say that it was more of an everyday case where instead of 3 million in the pension, they had more like 300,000, how would you see that playing out?
Subject to the length of the marriage, but let's just assume it's a conventional medium to long marriage. If there is such a thing, then I think in those circumstances, it is likely that the court would be looking at the income consequences of what's being done, and the teacher's pension at 150,000. One would want to understand the income that was being derived from that, the income that was being derived from the husband's £300,000 pension, and then totting up the income that's being received from both, and how with different percentage shares that would result in a broadly equal income for the parties during their retirement.
Thank you, that's been very, very useful. I think sort of to conclude for today, what would be your top tip for people to come away with after all we've discussed today about pensions?
Don't put it in the too complicated box, emotionally and technically.
Thanks very much, Rhys. That was really useful. And we'll have the links for all the reports that Rhys has mentioned today later for anyone who wants them. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Pleasure.